Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Geoff Shullenberger. This is Compact Conversations, the podcast where I sit down with one of Compact's contributors to discuss one of our articles. This week I'm joined by Stephen Adubato, who is the ISI editorial fellow at Compact, as well as the creator of the Cracks in Postmodernity Substack. So you can check out his work there on Substack as well as in our pages. Most recently, Stephen has written for us on the city of Newark, a piece under the title "In Newark, a Progressivism That Works." This is a piece he reported for us, speaking to various officials and political activists in Newark, and really just covering the mayorship of Ras Baraka. So Ras Baraka is possibly known to you as the son of his famous father, Amiri Baraka, a poet, activist, and Black nationalist radical who has, been controversial for many decades, passed away several years ago. And his son is now the mayor of Newark. So that's, an interesting fact. So, and, despite Newark being so close to New York City, it often seems to kind of fly under the radar. So Stephen, I think, has written an important piece because it's shedding light on what Ras Baraka has achieved as mayor, particularly in a period in which progressive rule in many cities like San Francisco, Oakland, and various other places has sort of been decried as the source of all these problems. And, in Newark, it would seem there have been significant improvements in public safety. So anyway, Stephen, thanks for joining me. I wanted to start by asking you, you are sort of connected to Newark by family and upbringing. So perhaps you could talk a bit about your personal connection to Newark and how it sort of informed your approach to this piece.
Yeah, so both sides of my family immigrated to Newark at various, different decades. But my father's side of the family was very much politically involved. My father's father, he was a public school teacher in the city, and he realized while working with the school board that he would have much more opportunity to create like substantial change in the city if he were involved with politics. So he decided to back the first African-American person running for mayor, Kenneth Gibson, in 1970. So this was 3 years after the riots, variously called a rebellion. Depends who you ask. But no, so in the 70s, he backed Gibson, which is, that was kind of anathema for an Italian to do in Newark. A lot of people were very angry at him, got a lot of death threats. But he decided, this is what we're going to do. Not so much because of, for him, like he would often tell people that he was not, quote unquote, a white liberal. Like Ken Gibson's race was inconsequential to him. The other person running for mayor, the incumbent, was Hugh Adenizio, who, was known to be very corrupt. He was, brought up on plenty of charges. My grandfather said, well, I rather back the better man. It doesn't have to do with his race. So Gibson won, brought some positive change into the city. But yes, like after the riots, crime went rampant. And that was also exacerbated by really bad urban planning, highways that kind of, they had to destroy a lot of neighborhoods that were doing pretty well. But also building these projects, these high rises, which just destroyed any sense of community, local businesses. So yeah, my family, that's why I have the personal attachment. I worked in Newark for several years. I lived in Newark as well. So yeah, all the reason why I wanted to write this piece is to really shed light on what I saw happening, which I think, I don't know, it's an example that other cities, other leaders can learn from.
So how was Baraka covered and perceived when he was first elected or in the campaign leading up to his election?
Clearly people associate him with his father. He learned a lot from his father, who, I mean, it's worth saying Amiri Baraka went through several phases throughout his life. I mean, he was a poet, he was a creative type, so his vision was always changing. Started out very much in like a very radical black nationalist position. Had ties with the Black Panthers, with other black nationalist movements, but there is a point where he kind of recognized that not only was black nationalism not really effective, he also came to just not really believe in it anymore because he said there was too much of a metaphysical component to it. He became a pure materialist, became a Maoist communist, and decided that, yes, white people weren't so bad after all. So no, he's constantly changing up his tone, but the fact that he was not only such like a bold political kind of figure, activist, but also that he was an artist, that he was this creative kind of type, definitely had an influence on his son. Um, but when his son Roz, so he got involved in the public school system. He did get involved in politics, served as deputy mayor under Sharp James. But I think he started to see that if you want to make substantial, lasting change, like you kind of have to play the game. Like this kind of antagonistic attitude is not going to get you very far. So he really started to understand, like, if I could bring all these different players to the table, we could make some real headway, especially when it comes to police brutality, violence in the city. So again, it's like clearly he went a different route from his father, but it's people aren't necessarily surprised that he ended up handling things the way that he did.
So the city had had numerous incidents of police brutality, going back to the riots that you mentioned, right, which were triggered by such an incident.
Mm-hmm.
And when Baraka came in, there was a significant development, which was the consent decree,
Yeah.
the federal consent decree. So, could you explain like what that was and how it marked a significant turning point in
Yeah.
the
I
sort of
mean,
relationship between the city and the police?
it was all kind of perfect timing because the consent decree was issued just a few days before Baraka was elected into office. But no, I mean, this had been brewing for several years ahead of time. And a large portion of it was thanks to the efforts of the People's Organization for Progress, headed by Larry Ham, who's currently running for Senate in Jersey. He's a grassroots leader who's been working since, I guess, the 80s to address like a kind of wide variety of local issues having to do with police brutality, housing, jobs, etc. But yeah, so People's Organization for Progress was kind of like they would have these weekly meetings at a church in central Newark, and if somebody had some situation with police brutality, or if you had a family member, people knew that they could go to these meetings and express their grievances. They could document it, and eventually they started collaborating with the ACLU to kind of put a file together and send it to the federal level. And that's when the formal consent decree was issued in 2014. Ras Baraka took it very seriously, and again, like I keep trying to reiterate in the piece, like he brought many different people to the table. He wanted the police department's input. He wanted these grassroots activists to be involved. Also instituted the Office for Violence Prevention, a street team. So these are like all these different kind of entities coming together to address the issue. So yeah, I mean, but without the consent decree, I mean, I don't think there would have been. I mean, like that was the real impetus that kind of brought about the changes that we're seeing in the city today.
Yeah, in some ways, it's quite surprising in that Baraka comes into office around the same time that the first sort of BLM protests are happening.
Mhm.
That around the same time as you have Ferguson, Freddie Gray in Baltimore, and all of these other incidents. And then obviously all of this culminates in 2020 when you have George Floyd and the sort of sudden momentum gained by this defund or abolish the police movement, which Baraka as you know, made headlines for sort of dismissing it and saying it's bourgeois liberal idea.
Mhm.
Um, so he's sort of dismissing it from the left in some sense, or at least using a kind of left, vaguely Marxian sort of rhetoric. So I mean, one thing that's kind of interesting here is again, Newark is it's quite close to New York City. It's not not far away from kind of the media spotlight, and yet it seems to have kind of had this somewhat distinct trajectory in dealing with all these issues that are so have been so central to public discourse over the past decade, and somehow it's managed to seemingly follow a quite distinct path and a much more kind of pragmatic one where it sort of hasn't been swept up in the same. Like in 2020, you had a number of city councils sort of abruptly say they were going to reduce police funding. Then a number of them end up reversing course a year or two later, after there's kind of a spike in crime. And so you have these kind of knee jerk, not very
Mhm.
thoughtful reactions that seem not to really uh, lead anywhere. And then you have, I mean, in New York City, you have Eric Adams, who's elected as kind of a former cop. So he's elected as sort of a law and order candidate, at least within the Democratic field. But, then he seems to be just really lacking in the kind of initiative you show that Baraka has had and doesn't seem to have an overall plan to pursue. So, I mean, one question would be what accounts for Newark's ability to kind of carve out this separate path where it seems to have remained, to have avoided the pitfalls that we've seen elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, the easy answer is that Newark is considerably smaller when compared to New York. But I mean, beyond that, I think it's that, at least under Mayor Baraka's leadership, uh, I mean, he's really kind of infused this sense of pride in the city. That I mean, that is his own. Like he grew up in the city, born there, worked there, taught in the schools. So like, there's a very strong personal attachment. Like he's completely invested, and if things go south, like it's his loss. It's not just like, oh well, too bad. I guess I'll move on to another job. So I strongly believe that without that kind of personal investment, but also like an intimate knowledge of the ins and outs of the city, all the different organizations, the different neighborhoods, how the dynamics are different. Like without really knowing a city well in that capacity, like it's hard to make effective policy changes. And again, that's hard in a city like New York that's huge, but I do think like someone in leadership who has that personal investment and that personal knowledge, like that would make a big difference. I mean, clearly, if you have someone who's a pure careerist who just wants to make their way up in the system, like how much change can they really do?
Yeah, and you argue that there's sort of a connection between that and this kind of or certain strains of black nationalism.
Mhm.
And there's probably a lot to be said. This sort of opens up a whole set of
Yeah,
different discussions because there's an argument from people like Adolph Reed that there's sort of a symbiosis between certain kinds of black nationalist rhetoric and politics and a sort of the neoliberal turn of the left where you're sort of focused entirely on cultural representation and
yeah,
that the economic issues that were central to the all basically all branches of the civil rights movement from Martin Luther King to the Black Panthers were all ultimately concerned about economic deprivation, and that these can kind of get sidelined in favor of just a kind of cultural politics of symbolic representation. Um, so Baraka seems, to have, in a sense, stayed truer to that more integrated version, where his nationalism or his kind of localism and communitarianism is tied to kind of fundamental economic issues and issues of power within the community.
yeah. I mean, first, I mean, we have to be careful not to turn black radicalism into a monolith because there are many iterations of it throughout history. But I do think like they're the kind of main strains that I see. Like you see this antagonistic one that nationalists like his father kind of played into, at least earlier in his life, which sets up the white man as the enemy and wants to kind of be in this constant state of battle. That's one way that can play out. I think the other way that his son is kind of emphasizing is that we need to start from the grassroots level. We have to start with what is most immediate. There, like I said, there's this kind of self-determinist strain within a lot of forms of Black radicalism. But the other thing that I think is it's controversial, but it's worth looking at is this sense of Black pride. If there isn't a sense of like if you as a people don't have a sense of your dignity, of your worth, then why, like, how are you going to fight for anything? Like, how are you going to advocate for your rights, for your city? And sure, that can become a kind of tribalistic, an idol in a sense that it becomes Black supremacy or white supremacy. But no, without that strong sense of pride, dignity, of belonging to a people, to a culture, a tradition, I think that's like what's missing from the identitarian, quote unquote, anti-racist rhetoric. Like there are no roots. There's no sense of blackness constituting a people with a tradition, with a set of beliefs. It's this abstract kind of identity which doesn't have any meat. Like you can't do much with it because again, the point of reference is this kind of global abstraction. It's not a particular people rooted in a locale. And again, like I think that's what Ras Baraka's kind of form of Black radicalism brings to the table.
One interesting thing is, I'm curious whether you find people on the left, whether the kind of black left or the sort of socialist left, commenting on Baraka's mayorship, does it have any kind of champions in left media, or has it really been noticed or taken as a positive thing, or is it essentially not getting much attention, or what do you take to be the sort of reception of it in the broader media sphere?
Yeah, I mean, I just don't think Newark gets enough attention in general. When he said the liberal bourgeois comment back in 2020, it was mostly right wing outlets like Fox News published, a headline on it. But yeah, the lefty ones, I didn't see much. I mean, there was a critical piece on him in Jacobin saying that his policy when it came to the school system was a little too neoliberal, which honestly I don't know enough to comment on. But again, I just think it's that Newark gets overshadowed by New York, which I don't know. I mean, I have a personal agenda to bring as many New Yorkers to Newark as I can because it's I mean, it really is a vibrant city. There are parts of it that's, it really has a life, it has a culture of its own. But yeah, no, I do hope that more outlets will learn from the example that the city's setting. Yeah.
One other thing you talk about is the role of the police themselves.
Mhm.
So I'm curious, given that there's such a kind of recent history of antagonism between, particularly black left wing activists and left wing politics more generally, and the police as an institution, it seems interesting that Baraka has sort of, despite there being this history and
Mhm.
a great deal of ill feelings about police actions, going back many decades, that there has been this kind of development of a working relationship. I'm
Yeah.
just curious how that has worked, and whether it was more or less already clear in his campaign that he would take that approach, or whether it was more just something that developed once he was in office.
I mean, I think in general in Newark, like prospects of police abolitionism is like that's a complete fantasy. Like that's not going to happen in Newark. So I think he always had it on his radar that like he wanted to improve kind of relations amongst residents and the police department. But once the consent decree was issued, like again, like that really gave him the impetus to like to go all the way. Um, and it motivated the other different bodies within the city to get involved, to kind of come to the table and start resolving things. But Yeah, I mean, I think there are like certain like practical kind of technical changes that they've made to, like I mentioned, the use of CompStat to kind of track, crime and arrests, installing body cams, things like that. But then, like I think what Baraka really understood is that there is a need to foster trust between the people and the police, like because ultimately they are there to serve the people. That's their job. So from hosting events within the neighborhood, teaching residents about safety, like I mentioned, they have workshops about how to install the Ring doorbells to kind of security cameras that you can have on the front of your house. But also having programs for high school students to come visit the police department to inquire about starting a career. All these things, I think, make it so that the police understand that their position is to be of service, but also for the residents to trust them, that when there are issues, they feel like they can go to the police. But more importantly, that like the police will recognize the people in the neighborhood that they're assigned to, so that there aren't these kind of like people aren't falsely arrested or there isn't brutality. Like I think that anonymity or that apathy, like that is a lot of what fuels police brutality, in addition to racial animus. Sure, that's definitely part of it. But yeah, I think the community policing model, like that's something to learn from. The other thing I would add, though, is that like both Larry Ham, who's again the grassroots activist, and the public safety director concurred that like there's so many tasks that civilians can take care of that don't need to be called into 911, and it's this part of the reason why police get burnt out and do a bad job at policing. Like there needs to be like we said, they instituted this Office for Violence Prevention. They have a street team. The street team played a huge role during the George Floyd protests. They have social workers. And like the ironic thing here is that as much as yeah, you do need to pump funding into these other entities for public safety, you do need to have enough adequate money within the police department so that you can hire more officers so that they aren't burnt out, so that they aren't overworked and can do a good job. But again, like if you're not intimately involved with all of these dynamics, if you don't know the ins and outs, it's going to be very hard to make the decisions to that will lead to actual change. It's much easier to have the knee-jerk reaction, say like, okay, defund the police or Blue Lives Matter. It's like, okay, I mean, what difference is that going to make at the end of the day?
Stephen, thanks so much for this piece and for taking the time to talk.
Thanks for having me out.
As always, remember Compact is an independent reader-supported publication, and we need your subscriptions to keep doing what we're doing. Subscribing for just $9 a month or $90 a year gets you full access to all of our content, as well as priority access to our Compact Events series, where we invite you to join us in intimate in-person conversations about politics and culture. Please also remember to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite channels, and if you like what we're doing, give us 5 stars. Thanks, and see you next time.